internet, and welcome back after my vacation hiatus. Back to making regular videos again, and today we're going to talk about the Battle of Tours. It's a battle that's also called the Battle of Poitiers, but since I've already had a Battle of Poitiers, I think we will go with the Battle of Tours this time. The Battle of Tours is the battle in 732, where the Franks, under their king's majordomo, Charles Martel, stemmed the Muslim invasions into the old Roman provinces of France. For quite a while, there has been some Umayyad invasions going on in southern France after they had taken Spain through Al-Andalus, and the Battle of Tours was where this was reversed and set the Franks on the path to create the later Carolingian Empire, and thus basically create Europe as we know it. So yeah, important battle. So let's talk about it. Enjoy. First, a bit of backstory. In the early years of the Muslim expansion from the old homelands in the Arabian Peninsula, they had spread across North Africa and into, of course, the Byzantine Empire. In the Byzantine kingdoms, they took over most, but was eventually halted for a while by Leo the Isaurian. But in the west, their expansion was more or less unstoppable. They took control over most of North Africa, expanded then in 711 into, yes, I know, it sounds like a convenience store, but in the year 711, the Umayyad army set off across the Straits of Gibraltar and landed in Spain, and very, very quickly conquered the minor Iberian kingdoms and formed, of course, the Al-Andalus provinces. After that, for a couple of years, they were reorganizing their armies, but then in middle of the 1710s, they took Septimania, an old Visigoth kingdom lying sort of straddling the Mediterranean at the current eastern borders of France and Spain. What that gave them was Narbonne, a very, very important naval harbor and town. So from there, they could constantly resupply their armies and so forth. And from there, they were going to further expand into the old Roman provinces of France, now currently under the dominion of the Merovingian Franks. The first place they attempted to conquer was the province of Aquitaine, then separate from the main Frankish kingdoms in the north and ruled by their Duke Odo, known to the world now as Odo the Great. In 1721, the Muslims out of the Umayyads in Septimania and Al-Andalus made a great army and invaded, as I said, Aquitaine, but was stopped at the Battle of Toulouse, where Odo gathered his army and managed to surprise and ambush the besieging forces in that town, sending them reeling back to their own domains. However, since the Muslim armies controlled Narbonne and therefore the great naval port, they didn't have to rely on supplies moving over the Pyrenees and could really, really quickly get reinforced, reorganized, and resupplied and be ready for round two, while Odo was at the same time distracted by the fact that he had also some fairly aggressive northern neighbors. Because you see, in the north, the Merovingian Empire was expanding again, or the Merovingian kingdoms were expanding again. After some down period caused by the peculiar inheritance rules by the Merovingian Empire, namely that all the sons of the king had to have equal inheritance, which meant that no matter how big a kingdom was, it was almost always split up upon the death of the king who had collected it. However, at this particular point, most of the central Merovingian kingdoms like Burgundy and Austrasia and Neustria had been recollected under the Merovingians, primarily due to the efforts of their primary sort of chief minister, if you want to call him that, the majordomo, master of the palace, Charles Martel, and his father. And, of course, these were also looking south to try to sort of reabsorb the old dominions in Aquitaine that had previously belonged to them, but was currently, as I mentioned before, independent. Odo, of course, didn't have any particular need to get under Merovingian dominion, so the Battle of Toulouse was a great thing for him because it sort of established him as a very legitimate ruler, someone who could defend his people against the invasions of the Al-Andalus Muslims. However, he also realized that because the Muslims so thoroughly controlled Narbonne, they would come back. And because he also needed to guard from the north and didn't want to swear oaths of allegiances to the northern Franks, he instead tried to make a deal with the Umayyad governor of Catalonia, or what is basically Catalonia. The two sealed the deal by marrying Odo's daughter to said governor, a Berber commander called Uthman ibn Naiza, and that, of course, meant that with that alliance, the raids into southern Aquitaine over the Pyrenees stopped, allowing Odo to gather his forces and prepare for the inevitable onslaught. This was in 1730. 730. I'm very, very sorry. However, within a year, that Berber leader overreached and killed a local bishop that the Muslims had allowed to stick around in order to control their local Christian population, and detached himself from his Arab masters in Cordova. And the then ruling viceroy of Al-Andalus, a fellow by the name of Abdul Rahman, then sent up an expedition and thoroughly crushed this particular attempt of rebellion. Now, this, of course, led Odo to lose his primary defense from the south, and again, only a few years later, Abdul Rahman decided that time was in. He was going to lead a major force directly to Odo's capital of Bordeaux, and there hopefully destroy him and take control of Aquitaine, thus continuing the Muslim expansion into the old Western Roman provinces. And, well, he succeeded. In about 1731, late 1731, the Muslim armies under Abdul Rahman arrived before Bordeaux. Odo met him with his entire army, but was crushed by the Muslim cavalry, and Bordeaux was plundered. Very shortly after, Odo, that is, tried to make a defense of the line of Garonne, but he was basically overwhelmed by superior numbers and superior maneuverability of the Muslim armies, and had to retreat frantically northwards, gathering as many scattered remnants of his army as he could, trying to maintain even some defense of the rest of his domains. At this point, of course, Muslim raids into central and middle France increased, actually reaching as far north as Autun and, Tours, just south of the primary Merovingian heartlands in northern France, Western Germany, and the Benelux territories of Holland and Belgium. Odo, now realizing he was completely out of options, made his appeal to the Franks. He sent direct messages to the Merovingian king, and of course more specifically to the real ruler, the majordomo Charles Martel, warning him that this massive Umayyad invasion was going on, and, well, could he please get some help to regain Aquitaine, and he would in return use whatever forces he had left to help Charles stem the incoming tide and preserve the northern Merovingian kingdoms as Christian nations, which was part of it. Charles, of course, saw an opportunity, realizing that, yes, he had to eventually face this enemy from the south. He agreed to march with his entire collected forces to help Odo, if Odo were first to swear a oath of allegiance and rejoin Aquitaine to the greater Merovingian lands. And Odo, as I said, at this point, realizing he had absolutely no other choice, did so. Now, the Umayyad viceroy Abdul Rahman would certainly have known about Charles Martel. Since 717, he had basically been fighting continuous war, which was now, of course, about 14 years later, to collect and reunite the various rump states of the Frankian kingdoms in the north. And he had, in fact, been spectacularly successful, basically rejoining the entire Merovingian kingdoms into one great and powerful centralized state. And in doing so, he had also, of course, created a very battle-ready, experienced army ready to move out at a moment's notice. It had been fighting almost continuously for, well, as I said, 14 years with great success without really any defeat. So its skill level, ability, morale, equipment, and training was really, really high. However, there are still some indications that the Muslim armies might have underestimated Charles. He was, of course, a wild barbarian from barbarian tribes. This, of course, was absolutely wrong. Charles was a very cultured man who had read up on Alexander of Macedon and were, in many ways, basically the premier general of Europe of his day. He did, however, have one major issue. He had no cavalry. This was the age of cavalry. This was the age where heavy cavalry could smash through practically any infantry, no matter how well marched up. The days of the Greek phalanxes and the days of the Roman legions were gone. While the Frankish armies were based on heavy cavalry, like the Romans, the discipline and the tactics the Romans used were certainly, to a certain degree, being lost, and at the same time, cavalry was getting that much more effective. So probably Abdul Rahman counted on his light cavalry to maneuver around Charles, and harass him, while his heavy cavalry would then smash into him. And that is how, by all means, logic and military tactical knowledge at the time, things should have been. However, again, Karl was a brilliant. I say Karl, and I'm very sorry, he should be Charles. I say Karl because in Danish he's Charles Martel, so I do apologize. But Charles was a brilliant military commander. He realized what was going on, and he realized this had to be stopped. So he gathered up all his forces and marched southwards to meet up with Odo, joined their armies together, and then decided to take a defensive stand against the invasion Umayyads. At this point, Abdul Rahman made a strategic mistake, though it might have been impossible to avoid. Instead of marching directly from Bordeaux north to deal with the gathered armies of Odo and Charles, he instead allowed his armies to basically plunder and devastate what is modern-day southern France. It is very possible that this was inevitable, considering the fact that his troops would, of course, have to a certain degree, be paid in plunder or whatever was necessary, but it did give the Franks the chance to choose their battlefields and to unite and train their armies as much as possible, as well as gather reinforcements all the way over from some pagan mercenaries along the Rhine, and possibly even there are even rumors that there might have been some Viking raiders joining in this particular army as mercenaries. But whatever happened, eventually in 732, Abdul Rahman moved his massive army north. I'm saying massive army because the sort of general historical idea has been that the Franks had probably somewhere around maybe 30,000 men against the about 80,000 available to the Muslims. Today, opinions are divided. There seemed to be a certain degree of belief that the armies were probably not that much different in size. Overall, contemporary records indicate that the Muslims started the campaign with about 50,000 men, but of course not all of them have necessarily been collected for the battle, as some of them were strung out as, well, controlling their recent conquest and still plundering and so on, and it's not even certain that Charles could manage to gather 30,000 men at that time. So overall, I think today that most people think that while the Muslim armies were starting out with about 50,000 men compared to Charles' about 30,000 when all things were said and done. The actual battle was fought with perhaps 25,000 Franks towards 30 to 40,000 Muslims. However, again, the Muslim armies were basically all heavy cavalry, which had broken Odo's infantry line in one single charge during the Battle of Bordeaux, and was probably expecting to do the same when they finally met up with Charles's hodgepodge of various northern armies. Admittedly, though, Charles had one major advantage. That was his central heavy infantry. Mainly, as I said, because they had been fighting together. They had been fighting for so long, and they had been fighting with him. They had absolute trust in their commander, and this made it very important in how the battle was actually to be fought. All contemporary sources show that the Muslims were actually surprised when the battle finally took place. For some reason or not, maybe because the scout parties had been lax in reporting back or had been plundering themselves, they didn't seem to realize that Charles had actually marched his forces right down south and were now right in front of them. Also, Charles had avoided the old Roman road and marched across country, which might also have achieved a certain degree of success. However, Abdul Rahman obviously thought that he could advance further north before the battle, but then suddenly realized that the major army was placed right in front of him. And this is where the concept of, Charles's troops believing implicitly in him and his genius comes in, because he placed his troops in a defensive phalanx formation to better resist cavalry charges, and he did it in such a way that he was basically on top of a small line of hills with some light and a bit more heavy from in places woodlands right in front of him to break up the inevitable cavalry charges. There is some discussion about whether the Muslims were planning on maneuver around them, but eventually it was becoming obvious that then they would be caught north of a major army and would probably be in a bad position. So Abdul Rahman then decided to attack Charles, and crush his forces, and thus leaving everything the Franks had open for an immediate conquest, trusting to the tactical superiority and of his cavalry. And again, this is where the Franks' discipline came into being. The Muslim charged. Their horsemen were certainly broken up by the terrain and the wooded areas, but they made repeated direct heavy cavalry charges against infantry. And by all rights, they should have broken them, or if the first break should have been unsuccessful, the infantry would probably have moved out of their formation to go after the heavy cavalry, thus breaking their own formation and allowing the cavalry to circle around and destroy them. However, Charles and his men trusted it. Charles had his men ordered to not move out of their defensive phalanx, and the men trusted him. According to, again, contemporary sources, several times Muslim horsemen managed to break into the Frankian phalanxes, but the phalanxes basically closed up, killed them, and presented weapons outwards again, and actually managed to, for the most of the battle, doing what was considered utterly impossible at the time, namely having an infantry line withstand direct charges of light and heavy horsemen. At this point, Charles have sent a small scouting force behind the Muslim army to approach and scout, or perhaps cause a bit of havoc in the Muslim camp. And this proved the turning point, because the rumor then went up that the Franks were taking the Muslim camp, which was where all the plunder taken from Bordeaux and the southern France areas were taken. So at this point, discipline broke down in the Muslim forces, who tried to return to reclaim their camp that wasn't actually taken, but, small, tiny details. This broke their discipline, and to the rest of the Muslim army that didn't hear those rumors, it looked like a full-scale retreat. They panicked, and it eventually became a full-scale retreat and, rout. At this point, Abdul Rahman himself tried to stop the rout with basically one last cavalry charge of his personal troops, but at this point he then became surrounded and cut down by the Frank armies, and the rest of the Umayyad troops then withdraw first to their camp, and then in a panic caused by the lack of their leadership and their belief that everything had gone against them, fled headlong into the south. The battle had been won, and, well, the Frankian kingdoms had been saved. Now, however, because of his absolute need to stand on the defensive in order to have his men's discipline win the day against cavalry charges, the next day Charles missed a strategic opportunity. He wasn't immediately re-attacked and was so certain that this was a sort of scheme that he kept his men in a very strong defensive formation, not allowing them to move out and attempt to, get into the Muslim ranks, and this basically allowed the Muslims to retreat unmolested for at least a day before Charles could send anyone after them. Of course, his lack of powerful cavalry meant that he couldn't really do more than following them with his by now tired and footsore infantry. However, he did push the Muslims back into Septimania and across the Pyrenees into El-Andalus, though according to, again, other contemporary sources, they did burn and plunder all their way there, so obviously they weren't completely destroyed, but the lack of Abdul Rahman and the defeat basically meant that, well, the Umayyads would never again try to strike over the Alps, and eventually also Septimania was regained for France. Aquitaine became an integral part of the kingdom that within 2 generations had been turned into the massive and Europe-spanning Carolingian Empire under Charles's grandson Charlemagne. So why is this battle so important? Well, as I already sort of stated, it basically broke the Western Muslim expansion into the old Western Roman provinces. If Charles had been defeated, there wouldn't have been a single force remaining to prevent the Umayyad forces from basically conquering and taking over all of Western Europe. Possibly not. Maybe the northern countries in Scandinavia could have resisted because of their naval strength, so could have remained sort of independent, at least in the islands and the major Scandinavian peninsula, but the rest of the West would definitely have been overcome. This doesn't mean it would have been permanent, but like the Battle of Vienna in 1683, the Battle of Tours is one of those where you can sort of say this determined the future of Europe. It basically meant that Europe would be a Frankian, culturally dominated Christian continent rather than either a Muslim continent under the caliphs, or for that matter a just continual battlefield that would never have developed into anything. That, if nothing else, is the legacy of Charles Martel and Tours. Well, that was it. A short video this time, I feel, and possibly not my best. I think I could have done better than that, but unfortunately, again, I am really sorry, people, but since my vacation, I've had a lot of things to do. I wanted to get this video out because I need to get back in the habit of making these weekly videos, or I will, my natural laziness will take over and I might not actually get things done. So it was really important to me to get this one out. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. I hope you found it interesting enough to perhaps read up a bit more on the Battle of Tours. Like I said, this wasn't my best one, I feel. I might actually go back and redo it at some point. I will definitely do a sort of this is Charles Martel, here is your life at one point, because he is a very, very fascinating, interesting, and important part of Western European history. But yeah, I'm back. I'm making videos again, and at least I hope you, despite its weaknesses, enjoyed it. So yeah, until next time, I have been the Sage, and I wish you all a very happy day.